Yeah, and there we go.
Okay, we're ready to go. I'll introduce you now.
All
Good
right.
air. Good afternoon. This is Joseph Donnelly from the Jersey Free Public Library. I am introducing you to today Professor Stephen Shore from Adelphi University, which he'll talk about senses and sensibilities, an inside view on sensory issues, and developing an easy to implement solutions. And good afternoon, Stephen. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing just great. It's great to see you, Joseph. Great to be back.
Likewise. So you can start.
Okay, so let's let the fun begin as we
Mhm.
look at sensory challenges that autistic people face. And this is important because everything that we know about the world comes through our senses, whether you're autistic or not. And for those of us on the autism spectrum, our sensory perception of the environment can be different and it can cause a number of challenges. So let's take a look at what brings me here to talk about sensory challenges to you, and then we'll get right into it. So taking it from the beginning, things were very typical at first. At 24 hours of age, my wife says, I looked like an egg. And then at 18 months, like what happens to about 30% of us on the autism spectrum, the regressive autism bomb exploded, where I lost functional communication, had meltdowns, withdrew from the environment, and in brief, I became a very autistic little kid. There was so little known about autism in those days. Where does autism come from? What do we do about it? Although I see the questions now focusing more on what can we do with autism? What can we do to work with the characteristics, including those that happen to be sensory related. So it took my parents a year to find a place for diagnosis. When they did, the doctor said, oh, your kid's too sick, send him to an institution. Fortunately, like we see ever increasing numbers of parents today, they advocated on my behalf. And they convinced the school to take me in about a year. And it was during that year that they implemented what we would today refer to as an intensive home-based early intervention program. And this was a program that emphasized music, movement, sensory integration, narration, imitation. And that's just today's terminology. Because in those days, the concept of early intervention didn't even exist. And what did my parents do? Well, first they tried to get me to imitate them. And imitation is a time-honored teaching strategy. Every one of you in TV land or Zoom land, I'm sure, has used imitation to teach something. Joe, I'm sure you've used it too. You show someone how to do something and okay, now you do it. But for autistic people, perhaps due to a difference in mirror neurons, it doesn't always work that well. So my parents flipped it around and imitated me. And once they did that, I became aware of them in my environment. And then they were able to move me along to the point where speech began to return at age 4. And I believe the key implication is that we need to meet the person where they are. And once you build that connection, only then can you move on. So I believe that we have the technology, we have the wherewithal, we have the ability, so that instead of looking at the closed door of autism and looking at autism as a series of deficits, disorder, and disability, we can look at the abilities of autism, opening the doors to success. And rather than being a bomb, you might say autism becomes da bomb. And autism becomes da bomb when we find a way to match strengths and abilities to something society values. And usually that translates into some sort of employment. So here we're talking about sensory issues. And sensory issues, or our sensory receptivity, or what we perceive from the environment, affects everything we do. So how does that play out? Well, here I am at age 4. I entered the school that initially rejected me. I got reevaluated. Instead of being considered as psychotic and ready for an institution, I got upgraded to neurotic. So things are moving up in the world. I also discovered the wonderful world of watch motors. Well, see, I was found by my parents taking apart a watch with a sharp knife. I'd pop open the back, extract the motor, remove the gears. spin them around, then put it all back together again. The watch still worked, and there weren't any pieces left over. So incredible fine motor control to take apart a watch. Well, where does that motor control go when it comes to penmanship? So many of us, me included, are penmanship disaster areas. One of the worst things I could experience in school, other than bullying, would be to walk into a room with a paragraph on the board. Because that suggested to me as an elementary school child that I was going to have to copy it down. And by the end of the period, I'd gotten through a few words and everybody else had gone to recess. Now we know a lot more about supporting people who have difficulty with the physical act, the motor control act of writing. So now, how could it be that I had the fine motor control to take apart a watch, with tiny little screws and gears and whatnot, not even using the right tool, a knife, but when it came to writing, which is also a fine motor control activity, well, what happened? And you can talk to your favorite occupational therapist, and they'll give you some interesting neurological explanations. Also, the idea of using different parts of the brain. In addition, what this also shows us the often sharp lines of demarcation between the abilities that autism gives us and also sensory differences can give us, and the disabilities that can come with these conditions. So for example, I know an autistic person who has hearing hypersensitivity. Just about everything hurts his ears. But at the same time, he's been able to use this incredible auditory sensitivity to become the best audio engineer I have ever seen. So that's an example of taking something that might often be considered as a challenge or a weakness and flipping it around and turning it into a strength. So my parents, instead of looking at the closed door of disability, disorder, and deficit, they looked at the open door of ability and soon provided all kinds of other devices to take apart and put back together again. So what is it like to experience sensory overload? Well, we're going to take a look. We'll get as close to it as we can online. When we're face-to-face, when I conduct this workshop face-to-face, I have an activity where one person plays the role of the autistic person, and their job is to listen to what person number 5 is reading to them, and then answer some questions about what was read. All at the same time, you got someone behind them rubbing the back of their neck up and down with an index card or a credit card. Somebody else is leaning close and reading really loud into that person's ear. You got somebody else patting the person on the head and shoulder at the same time. You've got another person, that's person number 5, reading a different paragraph at the same time. That's what you're supposed to listen to. If there's additional people, maybe we'll have someone snapping their fingers or tapping the person's forehead, all at the same time. So what is this like? Let's take a look at this video, which will show us what it can be like. So here we go.
The creature,
A million golden jellyfish spend their days softly pulsating in a small saltwater lake in eastern Palau. They're sitting too soft to harm snorkelers. About 12,000 years ago, water from the Pacific Ocean flowed into the lake basin, bringing jellyfish with it, but not predators. As a result, the golden jellyfish multiplied without restraint. The jellyfish do have one nemesis, Anamorphes, that lurk in the shadows of the water, ready to eat them. The jellyfish's consistently daily migration pattern helps keep them safe and well fed. They spend 14 hours popping up and down to gather them before chasing the sun from the east to the west. How many years ago did water from the Pacific Ocean flow into the lake basin?
I remembered hearing 12 something. 12? 12?
How many golden jellyfish spend their days softly pulsating into the small saltwater lake?
I didn't hear golden jellyfish.
And what is the jellyfish's main nemesis?
I have no clue.
What about, do you know anything about their daily migration patterns?
I just kept hearing something about a creature. No,
How many hours they bob up and down?
no.
So that gives a little bit of an idea of what it might be like. And as you can see, the person in the hot seat, you might say, was really unable to retain any information because there's just too much going on around them. And that is what it can be like for someone who has sensory processing disorder and is susceptible to sensory overload. And you can imagine how difficult school may be and in other situations where there's a number of people around and being able to just function. So what is happening? What is sensory processing? This is what your central nervous system does. Most of the efforts of your brain and the central nervous system is involved in making sense of everything around you. And most of the time, it does a good job. You can drive your car, listen to the radio, and have a conversation, and hear all the sounds that are going on outside all at once. And the brain just puts it all together and figures out what to ignore and what to bring to the foreground and what to send to the background. And you don't even think about it. But for the person with processing sensory disorder, this is when neurological processing gets inefficient. And it's almost like a traffic jam in the brain, indigestion of this material. And too much of it, or too much of some of the input gets processed and not enough of the others. And as a result, information received from the environment is unreliable. It's unpredictable. And that can cause for a lot of challenges and a lot of confusion. Now, what may happen is that the person may be hypersensitive or oversensitive, too much information comes in, or they may be hypo or undersensitive, not enough comes in, or even alternate back and forth between the two. So as we consider the senses, occupational therapists tend to divide the senses into outer and inner senses. There's the outer senses. We learned those in grade school: sight, touch, taste, hearing, and smell. We've also got 3 inner senses. The vestibular helps us keep our balance. Proprioception tells us where our body parts are in space and how much force to use to accomplish a task. And interoception tells us about our internal states. And what happens is some of these senses get overwhelmed. So for example, for me, many people like to wake up to the sound of birds chirping in the morning. For me, it sounds like their beak is scraping against my eardrum. Many autistic people perceive fluorescent lights, like many others perceive a strobe light. Now, a strobe light's fun on Halloween, but you're not going to get much work done in a room lit with a strobe light all day. Haircuts can be challenging for many people on the spectrum. Why is that? I had a lot of difficulties with haircuts. I used to tell my parents they hurt, but so little was known about the sensory issues in those days. Why would they hurt? Well, when hair gets cut, each strand gets a little tug along the way. Sensory challenges have implications for relationships. I spent a number of years, wouldn't kiss my father. And I even remember my mother was telling me, well, why don't you kiss your father? If there's a problem, we can't fix it until we talk about it. But I didn't have the verbal ability to describe that it was the smell of coffee on his breath and his beard that were just too sensorially overloading. And so that's an example of sensory issues interfering in a relationship. And those are the outer senses. There's inner senses, as I mentioned. The vestibular helps you keep your balance, proprioception. And here's one to try out even right now. Reach behind you and touch the back of your chair. If you do that, and Joe gave a really great example, and I can see Joe, and I bet everybody else, you didn't have to turn around to locate the back of your chair. You just knew where it was. You know where your body ends. You know where the environment begins. And we take that for granted. But for autistic individuals, we can't. And if you don't know where your body is in the environment, then you're going to have a lot of trouble doing everything else or anything else. How much force do you use to accomplish the task? How many of you take for granted you know just how hard to hold a pencil and move it around to write and take notes? And I saw Joe, it looked like Joe was taking notes a little bit earlier, writing something or other. Yes, and I'm pretty sure Joe is just taking it for granted that he knows how hard to hold his pen and how far to push it around to write. But for autistic people, there's a lot of focus and concentration on that, and we're still not getting it right. And if you're so focused on the mechanical aspects of writing, how much is left for the cognitive aspect, the creative aspect of writing? So some things that are important to be aware of. Interoception, inner bodily states. This is what tells you when you've eaten enough and you're full. This is what gives you butterflies in the stomach. This is when you feel too hot or too cold. That's all interoception. And some of us have a really good sense of interoception. Others are more challenged. I have a friend of mine who almost died of a burst appendix. And why is that? She didn't feel the pain that goes along with appendix that's getting inflamed and about to burst. Pain that would send most of us to a hospital, but not her, because she just didn't feel it. Fortunately, they caught it in time, and she's still alive and still doing very, very well. So with the vestibular sense, those of us who are hyposensitive may be sensory seekers, looking for sensory input. So I was the kid who would spin around all day, who would climb a tall tree and let it blow in the wind. Deep pressure often calms the proprioceptive sense. So I was always seeking deep pressure under mattresses, weighted blankets. This is part of the reason that I speak about autism around the world, because doing so involves getting in an airplane and getting there, or at least when there isn't a pandemic, that's how you do it. And there's a lot of vestibular and proprioceptive input when an airplane takes off. And it gets even better when it goes through turbulence. And I don't know why people are turning various shades of green when we go through bumpy air, but I'm having a good old time. And watching the wings also, they kind of flap up and down when the plane goes through bumpy air. And why do they do that? Well, many people have various mechanical and scientific explanations as to why they do that. But the real reason that airplanes flap their wings when they're going through turbulence is because airplanes too are autistic. And they're just enjoying the ride as much as anybody else. So these are the senses that occupational therapists look at and consider as they recognize and support individuals with sensory issues. What else to keep in mind? Sensory issues may affect how we wear clothing. So my clothing tends to be loose because clothing that's too tight provides too much sensory input. However, I have another autistic friend who craves tight clothing because that tight clothing helps him keep track of his body within the environment. So there's that proprioception again. My hat, many of you may think that this is a fashion statement. And in many ways it is, and it's always good to support my university, Adelphi University, right up in New York on Long Island, not too far away. However, it's really an accommodation because for me, being under recessed lighting fixtures is probably like looking into a spotlight for most other people. Here is the relatively simple accommodation. So continuing on, what is the role of sensory issues and self-stimulatory behavior? So as we think about self-stimulatory behavior, it's often defined as repetitive non-functional behavior. And everybody here, I'm sure, engages in this type of behavior. I'm sure some of you bounce your leg when you're sitting in a chair, doodle with your pen or pencil, play with your hair, fiddle around with things. That's all repetitive and non-functional, or is it? And if you think about why you do this behavior, when I ask people in the audience or in my classes that I teach, Eventually somebody gets to, well, it helps me concentrate. I'm not exactly sure why, but it helps them concentrate. And they're exactly on the right track. Because what that person is doing, what you're all doing, autistic or otherwise, is really engaging in self-regulatory behavior. Because the brain, it's a marvelous organ, and it knows when it's over and understimulated. And you're either trying to upregulate so you don't fall asleep, or downregulate because maybe you're a little bit too anxious. So what's the difference between autistic people and non-autistic people? Well, non-autistic people tend to be more sensorially dysregulated. So the attempts to sensorially regulate are going to be greater. One example, probably the most stereotypical behavior that we see in autistic people, hand flapping. Now, is there anything wrong with hand flapping inherently? You watch a show like The Price is Right, contestants get called down from the audience, they jump up and scream, jump up and down and flap their hands, and it's fully acceptable. No, there's nothing really wrong with flapping, but perhaps it's intrusive in a particular situation. Say classroom. So what can I do to help the student who needs to self-regulate in this manner? And maybe it's disrupting other people. Well, there's a number of options. One thing I would do, or I should say one thing I wouldn't do, is say, Joseph, quiet hands, hands down. You're disturbing the class. Because what's going to happen? Well, the hands may go down for a few moments, but guess what's going to come right back up? Or even worse, a different behavior is going to take its place that will be more challenging and difficult to deal with. So what I would do is I'd walk right over to Joseph's desk and put a therapy ball in his hands and say, here, squeeze this. And what I've done is I've introduced a mutually exclusive behavior. I've also turned away from the deficit model of saying, don't do this. I tell someone not to do something, well, that leaves a hole. Then what do you do? But instead, if I say do this, the this being squeeze a ball, which is pretty easy to do, there's a pretty good chance that Joseph is going to meet his self-regulatory need. And that's perhaps less intrusive than flapping hands. And if he really needs to flap and it's intrusive, let's see if we can find a place that where it might be less disruptive in a given situation. So there's a number of strategies that can be used for people who need to self-regulate, people who have the wiggles. And here are just three very common examples that we see in school. You can get heavy rubber bands for the front of a desk. This is for a child who seems to need to move their feet a lot. So they just kind of bang their feet against that thick rubber band, and that provides some movement. I've seen a variation on that with a set of pedals, almost like a partial elliptical bike underneath the desk. So kids are pedaling, or adults too. And that helps to self-regulate. You see in the middle some sort of squeeze device, therapy ball, not really a ball, kind of a cylinder, but same idea. And what I've also seen occupational therapists do is take Velcro, the sticky side and the soft side, tape it underneath the desk. And then the student can run their fingers along the soft side or the hard side, whatever they need to do. And that's another way to get needed sensory input. Sometimes I wonder if this guy has some sensory issues. And if you know someone who has any of these characteristics, autistic or otherwise, then the chances are that they may have some mild sensory challenges. For example, the person you know who may be a bull in a china shop, who doesn't know their own strength, that's someone who has some mild challenges with proprioception. So as we talk about sensory issues, there's a lot of neurology involved. And what happens? Well, if we think about sensory input enters the brain through the reticular activating system. It all comes through the brainstem, except for the sense of smell. That goes directly from the nose to the brain. Everything else goes through the path that you see here. And then what happens is the brain itself will make a determination, is this important information? And if it's important, it'll get sent along for further processing. If it isn't, the brain just throws it out. And if we think about what percentage of information is kept, it's pretty amazing, because most of it just gets thrown away. 75%, 3/4 of all information around you. I'm looking at Joseph here, and it seems like there's somebody behind him who maybe pulled a book out of the little library there off the shelf. And if he was getting all information from the environment, he would be distracted by what's going on behind him and wouldn't be able to focus on what we're doing. Joseph is pretty good at keeping whatever sounds that he does hear, whatever input he is getting from the person behind him, and putting it in the background. And this presentation is in the foreground. And that's another challenge that autistic people face, foreground versus background. And it's to such a point where you can imagine that where for most of us, if we watch cable TV, there's hundreds of stations available. And you flip from one to the next, one at a time. For the autistic person, it may seem like that all the channels are on at the same time. And that would be the person whose sensory filters are filtering out less information. So maybe they're getting 50% of environmental information. Maybe they're getting all of it. And that's not an easy way to be. So that 25% exit through, that gets moved right up to the reticular activating system. And the brain decides if, is this a dangerous thing? And if it is, that's the fear response, fight, flight, or fright. That is, those are the reflexes. So you touch a hot stove by mistake, you cannot train yourself out of not jumping back. And you could, I guess, conceivably train yourself not to jump back if you intentionally touch a hot stove. I don't know why anybody would do that, but I suppose you could. But if it's touched unexpectedly, you're going to jump back before you even know what happened. That is the fear response. And all of this happens before you even know what's going on. The brain is taking care of all of this. For information that's not dangerous, that gets moved up and for additional processing. And this is where learning takes place. So there's a lot more information about this that can be researched on. It's very interesting. And for those who are further interested, I can point you to additional resources. So looking at case studies. Oh, here's Robert. Growing up in gym. That's a terrible thing to do. What's going on? This happened at a school for autistic children that will remain nameless to protect the guilty. And the deal is that when he entered the school gym, he'd get kind of glassy-eyed and throw up. And there was a team meeting about this. And they decided that Robert was very manipulative. And that he manipulated himself into throwing up so that he could get out of gym. They decided that his paraprofessional would make him help clean up the mess before sending him out to time out. So might there be another reason for this behavior? And I think there may be. Now, if we think about physical education, especially in a grade school, it's noisy, there's a lot of echoes. People bump into you unexpectedly. There's a lot of movement. It's smelly. And all these things combined together could make someone who has sensory issues very anxious. And when people get extremely anxious, well, sometimes they throw up. So what I would do with Robert is that I would have a talk with him. Robert, it seems like gym is difficult for you. Validate his sense of anxiety. Hey, Robert, everyone has to get their physical education. So let's come up with a plan. I'll go with you to physical education, says the paraprofessional, just like I always do. And you'll go to class, as you always do. But when you've had enough, you come over to me, and then we'll go outside and get some, we'll get the rest of your physical education. We'll do some activities outside. And in that way, what we've done is we bring Robert's anxiety level down. When anxiety goes down, coping goes up, and he may be able to spend more time in physical education. Or if he really can't, then we found a solution for the problem. These are some resources, some helpful resources. And there's many more of them being developed all the time for recognizing and supporting people with sensory issues. Oh, here's another case study. Here's Jerry. She's the girl who started fights in the line. 8th grade, often hits other students, is accused of starting fights. Her usual response, oh, well, they hit me first. So you observe. And what's happening? Nobody's hitting her. But what does happen is sometimes somebody's jacket, their bag, or their arm accidentally brushes by Jerry, who's in the middle of the line. She's hypersensitive to touch. So to her, that's perceived as a punch or a slap. And most people, when they're punched or slapped unexpectedly, they will strike out before they even know what happened. So how can we help Jerry? Well, maybe we could use a social story, picture schedule, or some other type of communication device to inform her that hitting people when they touch you accidentally is not a good thing to do. You shouldn't do that. And she may be able to learn that. However, she won't be able to implement it because this is a fight, flight, or fright response. It's a reflex. It happens before she even knows it. So we would be much better off, number one, perhaps offering Jerry a job. Jerry, I've got a job for you. How would you like to be the line monitor? And students like to do jobs for the teacher. She's happy to do it. And also, now that she holds the door and is behind the door, the line goes through, and then she takes her place at the end of the line, which is exactly where she should be, so that she can monitor her distance from the person in front of her. And then if we're going to use a social story or some other communicative device, we can now use that to teach her about her hypersensitivity, and maybe there's something that she could do in order to keep herself out of these situations. Possibly making sure the crowd goes through first, or making sure that she's always at the end of the line instead of being towards the front or in the middle, where things can be much more challenging. So as we continue, it's important to know when sensory supports are needed. And here's an example of someone who is sensorially overloaded in what is ostensibly a quiet environment. You're not seeing the rest of the picture, but the rest of the picture is him in a auditorium taking a test. Now, this could be in high school, this could be in college, and he's sensorially overwhelmed in a quiet environment. And why is that? Because his hypersensitive hearing is hearing all of the shuffling, the sound of student pencils scratching the test as they're being written on. Some students may be nervously tapping their foot, for example, and that's just too overwhelming. So for someone in this situation, we now need to provide some sort of accommodation, which could be, say, taking the test in a quiet room. However, it's also important to be aware of all of the potential sensory challenges that a person faces. And I remember a situation where a college student advocated for herself and did a good job, and people seemed to understand what she needed. She asked for a quiet room. She got it. She also has visual sensitivities and perceives fluorescent lights like a strobe light. For some reason, the proctor decided that the light needed to be on while she took the test. which she didn't need. So as a result, she wasn't able to take the test. Sensory issues can cause challenges in other aspects of life, in relationships, dating, intimate relationships, sexuality, hygiene. All of these tend to be highly sensorially, with a lot of sensory input. Hygiene, for example, I know many people who report that taking a shower is like standing under a hail of bullets. You think about intimate relationships, there's a lot of sensory input there too. I have a friend who desperately wants to date, but holding another person's hand is just too much sensory input. So this can be the topic of a whole nother presentation. So when I return, maybe we'll talk about relationships and sexuality for autistic individuals. Employment. It's important to find ways to be aware of, to accommodate for perhaps unusual responses to sensory stimulation. So for example, I know a fellow who just loves to fold laundry. Pull laundry out of a hot dryer and fold it. He has a lot of challenges. He doesn't speak. He uses a communication board. He needs support for communication, managing a schedule, and many other things, but this is just something he likes to do. Maybe he likes the sensation of freshly dried clothes, like a cat who will jump into a pile of freshly dried laundry. And he loves folding them. Maybe he likes the perfect creases. And they're important to him, helps him feel in order. But whatever it is, that's what he does. And he folds clothes faster and better and more enthusiastically than anybody else I know. Those with good visual motor skills, perhaps small parts assembly, or making sure quality control for the things that are, or devices that are made by a machine. You got to make sure that they all come out perfectly formed, in the right order, the right color, whatever it might be. So these are some of the things that I think about when it comes to sensory processing. Sensory processing, autistic people process the world differently than most others. And by gaining an awareness and understanding of these differences, we can provide supports for individuals who are susceptible to these challenges and help these individuals lead fulfilling and productive lives. So I guess we have a little bit of time for questions before we end the session.
Well, only question I have is, I learned a lot about sensory input and sensory overload, and how it's a challenge for anybody who has a learning disability or who has, on the autism spectrum. So it's very interesting.
No, I'm glad.
Mm-hmm.
And what I find is that as we develop sensory accommodations for susceptible individuals, we may start out initially developing these accommodations for just a few people, or even just that one student or one employee in the workplace. They actually help everybody else. So if we tone down the lighting, if we exchange fluorescent lighting, which research suggests has a negative impact on everybody's productivity, autistic or otherwise, but much more for autistic people, then everybody gains in the process.
Or like tone down the loud noises and to a minimum, so they won't be easily distracted, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Whether it's a learning environment or a working environment or a sleeping environment, turning down those excess noises can be very helpful for everyone.
Absolutely. I think that's it. I'm the only person here. This is being recorded.
Okay.
I will get a chance. I will send this to you, and I'll send you an email afterwards about anything else if I can think of. Okay.
All right. That sounds great.
So thank you for coming today and demonstrating and learning as a learning experience for people about sensory issues for on the autism spectrum and anything and learning disabilities as well. That is great. Thank you
Oh,
very
my pleasure.
much, and hope to see you in the near future.
Yeah.
And maybe next year when you could do in-house when
Yeah,
things are
I
starting
look
to,
forward to that. Yeah.
yeah, so we're starting to take a turn in for the better recently.
Yeah.
So here at the library. So let's I'll think about it and we'll talk about it next year, or I'll talk to you soon about it.
All right. Sounds good to me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Good to see you, Joseph.
So thank you very much, Dr. Stephen Shore, and we'll talk to you in the future.
Talk to you soon.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye.